Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Canada Ireland Foundation's Imbolc event. My name is Cheryl Shindrock. I'm a member of the board of the Canada Ireland Foundation and chair of the programming committee. And on behalf of the chair and the board of directors of the foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Imbolc talk entitled Resistance, Resilience, and Reflection. This gathering is part of our annual Imbolc Festival Talk series, celebrating the work and impact of women. It continues the Foundation's commitment to spotlighting voices that challenge, inspire, and transform. Past editions of our Imbolc Talks are available on the Foundation's YouTube channel, featuring conversations with former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, Dr. Alan Corbiere, Shafra O'Leary of the European Court of Human Rights, Nancy Smythe, Canada's ambassador to Ireland, and Irish rugby player Lindsay Peat, to name a few. Today marks the Foundation's first event in a full year of programming as we prepare to open the Corlac Building, our new home on Toronto's waterfront. Our speakers this evening include Lian Bell and Sarah Durcan, who are co-authors of WTF Happened, Waking the Feminists and the Movement That Changed Irish Theatre, together with Andrea Donaldson, the artistic director of Nightwood Theatre, Canada's oldest feminist theatre company located here in Toronto. These women will shortly be introduced more fulsomely by our moderator, Karen Fricker. Karen is a professor of Brock University and a professional theatre critic. She focuses her research in contemporary theatre and globalization, contemporary Quebec theatre, popular performances of national and cultural identities, and Irish theatre. She is the founding editor of Irish Theatre Magazine, an online cultural journal that provides coverage of theatre and the performing arts in Ireland. She has also reviewed and broadcast for such media outlets as The Guardian, Variety, The New York Times, the BBC, and the CBC. And she is a former theatre critic for the Toronto Star. So before I turn it over to Karen, though, just a couple of housekeeping matters. We have organized this session to run approximately 90 minutes. So we hope you'll be able to stay with us for the duration. And if you have questions for our speakers, and we do hope that you will, you can use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen to post them. We will monitor them and we will share them with our speakers for the Q&A session toward the end. Thank you again for joining us and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everyone. It's so great to see people coming in on our attendees button. My name is Karen Fricker, as you've heard, and I am delighted to be convening this session, which brings together leading voices around feminism and theatre in both Ireland and Canada. The provocation for this session was the publication of the book WTF Happened, Waking the Feminists and the Movement That Changed Irish Theatre. And I had the good fortune to be present at the Abbey Theatre last October in Dublin when there was a launch event for the book, and hearing some of the women involved in the making of the book, including Lian Bell and Sarah Durcan, talk about it was so inspiring. And I had the idea then that we might want to bring that conversation here to Canada and have them talk about what this movement was that they spearheaded and what they're writing about in this book. And then have some response from us here in Canada about the resonances of what was happening in Irish theatre 10 years ago now, 11 years ago now, with what happens with us here on Canadian soil. So I will introduce our panelists more fulsomely, and I will particularly thank Lian Bell and Sarah Durcan for being here. They are in Dublin, where it is 5 hours later than us, so they have stayed up late for this meeting, and many thanks for that. So with a background in scenography, visual art, cultural project management, and social activism, Lian Bell has worked for over 25 years with some of the most significant arts organizations and contemporary performance makers in Ireland. She was campaign director of hashtag Waking the Feminists, the grassroots campaign that changed Irish theatre. I'm going in alphabetical order. Andrea Donaldson is the artistic director of Nightwood Theatre, as you've heard, Canada's preeminent feminist theatre in Toronto. For 2 decades, Donaldson has played a pivotal role in fostering new works for the stage in her role at Nightwood, as Tarragon Theatre's associate artistic director, and as a freelance dramaturg and director. Her projects have garnered numerous nominations and awards. And I will make a plug here for a production that Andrea is currently directing called You Always by Erin Shields, which is currently on at Canadian Stage, which is a beautiful feminist piece of theater that is still on for another week. So please try and check out, if you are in Toronto, seeing You Always at Canadian Stage. You won't regret it. And our final speaker is Sarah Durcan, who is co-author with Lian of the book WTF Happened. She has contributed to writing on gender, culture, and science communication. She is former CEO of Science Gallery International, has served on the boards of the Abbey Theatre, Theatre Forum, and Gaze Film Festival, and has been active in politics. So welcome to you three, and welcome to everyone here. The format that we're going to follow, which we've all agreed to, is that I'm going to ask our two Dublin speakers to introduce what Waking the Feminist was and to tell us a little bit about the movement and its aftermath. And that's going to take us about 20 minutes. I've asked Andrea to be prepared to listen and respond to what she's hearing and offer her thoughts and questions back to Liam and Sarah about what she's heard. I'm going to ask Andrea then to talk about Nightwood Theatre and feminist theatre in Canada. And then I'm going to move us forward to talk about the current landscape of feminist theatre in both places. And then we will be taking questions from the Q&A box. So please fire questions into the boxes if you have one. We won't take questions until the end, but please just put them forward as you have them because you might forget. So thank you, everyone. And Sarah and Lian, can I ask you to kick us off by telling us what sparked the movement hashtag Waking the Feminists?
Thank you so much. I just realized we haven't rehearsed this. Sarah, I will just jump in if that's okay. Seeing as we've got 20 minutes to talk about more than a year of activism. Thanks for having us, first of all. Let's get that out of the way. So to give a little bit of context for anybody who's not familiar with theatre in Ireland, the Abbey Theatre, which we'll talk about a lot, is the national theatre in Ireland. And the 2015, which is when we're talking about this whole kicking off happening, was the eve of the centenary of the Easter Rising, which was the start of a kind of a real move towards independence. Irish independence. And the Abbey Theatre, people who were involved in the Abbey Theatre at that time were very involved in that Easter Rising. So the Abbey Theatre and theatre in Ireland and sort of that struggle for independence were very interlinked. The Abbey at the end of 2015 announced their programme for 2016 for that year of that centenary year. And I, at the time, and a few other people, back in the day when we were all on Facebook and Twitter, I was at the time working as a freelance set designer, and I saw the program and just went, there aren't very many women's names in that, and counted them up, realized there really weren't very many women's names in it, and made a comment on Facebook, thinking either nobody will care, and this will disappear, or maybe I'll be like shunned and I don't really care. But to my enormous surprise, a huge amount of people also chimed in saying, absolutely, this is not appropriate and not right for this day and age for our national theatre to not be championing women artists. Cue proper tsunami of social media activity within hours and then certainly within days, like really quite overwhelming. people sharing their stories. Clearly, it not just being about the National Theatre, but more about, well, seeing that there was inequality in theatre in general in many aspects, not just about what's on stage, but what's, jobs for people off stage as well. And then not just theatre, of course. Once you start talking about inequality, feminist look at society more generally, you start realizing that there's inequality everywhere. So the conversation really snowballed very quickly. Cut to a week later, after that first post, when a group of us were sitting in a very shabby office of a theatre company in Dublin, and the group were made up of sort of self-selecting people who wanted to be part of doing something. And they were heads of organizations, they were freelance artists. Many of us knew each other, but maybe had never worked together. And we knew at this point that people were calling for a meeting, a public meeting, to have a discussion about this. Cut to a week after that. So this is 2 weeks after those first posts. And I was just pulling this open because here is the book, but also here is a photograph of the front of the Abbey Theatre. This became kind of the iconic photograph of Waking the Feminists, with a couple of hundred women standing outside the front of the Abbey Theatre about to go in for the first public meeting, where 30 different women got up on stage and read little speeches that they'd written about their experiences in theatre. And it was like, I can't even describe how seismic it was. Everybody was watching, all the newspapers, all the media. Handily, over the previous week, there had been a concerted campaign to get international celebrities to support the campaign online. And that morning, Meryl Streep a photograph had come up with Meryl Streep saying she supports Waking the Feminists. So, of course, all of the, not just sort of culture savvy media, but all of the media, including tabloid media, suddenly wanted to know what was going on. So we had news crews, we had photographers, we had journalists turning up, and so on. This is all incredibly fast. And I will jump to, it became a campaign. And Sarah and I were part of a core group who decided to give over a year of energy and time to try and make systemic change within Irish theatre. Can I hand it to you, Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Lian. And I will thank you so much for that intro. So can I ask you, Sarah, as someone who didn't make the first Facebook post, that was Lian, when did you jump on? And maybe can you talk about that shift from we're having a meeting at the Abbey to we want this to be a campaign and we want a campaign for systemic change?
Yeah, I think so many people saw what Lian was doing, and there were other people involved in that as well. And I wasn't working in theatre. I had been a theatre producer, and I worked as general manager of Dublin Theatre Festival as well. So I was slightly outside it. And I think we recognised the risk of speaking truth to power in that. Just for a little bit more context, the director of the Abbey was due to retire, or was due to move on after 10 years. The defense of what had happened was almost worse than the offense. There was this Twitter conversation between himself and Belinda McKeown, and others as he was going to the airport on holidays for it was a half-hour quick conversation. And one of the tweets was, "Them's the breaks. I just program the people I want to work with and I like to work with," and steam exploded. But anyway, after that first meeting, there was such a sense of, we're not explaining this problem. We're not having a discussion about it. There were 30 women on stage. It was a sellout event. There was a response from the Abbey. They apologized straight away. The board there was such an onslaught of the media. The board were kind of, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? But they accepted it straight away. And we very quickly moved into, what are we going to do about it as a community? Because as so many of us were really practical theatre people, it wasn't that was just an event, wasn't that nice, that's somebody else's problem. We made ourselves own it for the year, and then handed the responsibility back to the sector. And really early on, we had very clear objectives, equality for women in Irish theatre, equal pay, equal opportunities, and equal championing of women. And those really became, well, what could we focus on if we have a year? And it wasn't everything. There was every idea under the sun. And what we focused on was governance and making sure that organizations were responsible at the very top for setting long-term strategy and then keeping an eye on it. And we used peer pressure, and it really wasn't comfortable then for every other theatre, because everyone loves beef with the Abbey. There's always a scandal at the Abbey or something has gone wrong. It's just a regular thing because it's so intertwined with the history of the state, and in creating the sense of what it is to be Irish way back to 1916. That's why it was such an important year, not just for the country, but for the theatre itself. So in that, in forming Irish identity, we were saying, well, listen, how can you talk about Irish identity and talk about Waking the Nation, which was the name of the programme, hence where Waking the Feminists came out of as well, which, if you're familiar with Irish culture, waking has two senses, as in you're mourning, you're waking, but you're also waking up. So it was a very clever play on words, which we gladly stole. And a year was practical for us to be able to focus on these things. About halfway through the year, I found myself on the board of the Abbey and therefore responsible after calling them out. But as I was saying just a moment ago, the discomfort in the rest of the sector about, oh, no, it's not just the Abbey, it's all of us, and having to take collective ownership of it as a systemic thing, not just one person's artistic choices. We recognized by doing some very quick research, like we Googled, how do you fix gender inequality in theatre, in anything? And lots of us did searches on things like that. And we're saying, I think there's this thing called unconscious bias. Like, we didn't know an awful lot about this kind of stuff. We were on such a vast learning curve for the entirety of the year. And Lian, you talk about this brilliantly. We're just like one step ahead of, everyone asking us questions, and suddenly we were supposed to be the experts. So there were a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and we met with all of the leading theatre companies. We commissioned groundbreaking research we had amazing academics who stepped forward and went, we can help you. Amazing, but you have to have it done by next November, which, as those of you who work in academia know, is like, well, that's kind of scary. So we got funding from the Arts Council, we got funding from the Community Foundation as well, but most of it was voluntary work, and we had hundreds of meetings throughout the year. We went all out to try and solve this. And then at the end of the year, we had two other public meetings, one on International Women's Day in Liberty Hall, and one at the end of the year to and throughout that time, we kept pressure on all of the companies, first of all, to make statements that they would do something. And then at the end, to bring them all together to really workshop and hand over to a working group, the Gender Equality Working Group, to come up with policies, which were then published and made public by the Minister for the Arts in, I think, 2018. So it took a while. But, there's this really, really fast, hot, heavy work where everyone's on board. And then there's the slow work, which has taken time to do since then. And it led into, the whole Me Too movement in Ireland as well, and of what is now a brilliant Safe to Create programme. We got the Minister to introduce national policy across all our national cultural institutions, not only around gender equity and diversity, but also around broader DEI, which was coming to the fore very much in 2015, 2016. I'll pause for breath there.
Yeah, could I just add two other things as well that were really important? Was that we realized from very early on that not everybody cares about theatre, and that's fine. But what we thought we could do, being a really kind of networked and media savvy group of people who could put on really, really good events and be really articulate. We thought if we could make really significant change in one small area of society, that it would have a knock-on effect. And it would also give other women in other areas, other feminists in other areas, encouragement and inspiration to make change in their own sectors, which it did, which was kind of amazing to watch. And the other thing was that this was like really grassroots, and we tried to make sure that it was maintained as grassroots as possible. So we talk about we all the time, and I'm really aware that we is a very that's a very loose term in terms of Waking the Feminists. There was a kind of I suppose a core group of maybe 3 or 4 of us who kind of just sort of stepped up and said we would do this. I at one point gave myself the title of campaign director because, you know, we sort of agreed that I would be partially paid for some of the work that I was doing, so I was able to kind of take that role. But there was a really core team of people, including Sarah and some others, and then a slightly wider committee where people kind of moved in and out of as they needed to because everyone was voluntary. But then there was a much bigger grassroots community all around the country, and in fact, not just in Ireland, in England, in America, particular in Australia. And we decided that if you wanted to call yourself Waking the Feminists and put on an event or, you know, propose something, then you were. You know, you were, if you wanted to be part of Waking Feminists, you were. And to not be proprietorial about who was in and who was out, that was really important. And the other thing to flag is that 1 year thing, which was quite a fast decision on our behalf of just this feels feasible, and in retrospect was incredibly useful because it meant we were able to put our energy into it without thinking this was going to go on forever and ever, so we could really like push hard for a year. But also we were able to then say to the rest of the sector, when we get to this point, it's up to you. Like, this is really important and you need to take ownership of it. So there is a timeline, there's a deadline. So in retrospect, that was a really smart thing for us to do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And spoiler alert, like 10 years later, we can say it has worked, you know, by and large. Like, certainly there's still a lot of work to be done. But even 5 years on, when we did the figures again, because as you know, been familiar with theatre programming, it's pretty short. If you're programming 18 months, 2 years in advance it's much shorter in Ireland. You know, it can be 6 months to a year at most, even for the Abbey. So we knew that the cycle of change could happen pretty quickly. And when we looked at the figures, it had gone from, something like 20% average to hitting almost 50 within 5 years. Now, again, numbers don't tell the whole story, but it showed change was possible. And that was incredibly gratifying.
Thank you. Can you say what the main obstacles were that you faced? And what supports or successes surprised you?
I think, well, in my perspective, the main obstacle or the thing that I found hardest to deal with, and bearing in mind, like Sarah said, we were learning as we were going. So we were kind of like, we're smart and we're capable people, but there was a lot of knowledge we had to accrue over time, and dealing in real life situations with people, trying to encourage people and sort of cajole people into making change. The thing that I found the hardest were the people who said, yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Yeah, we should definitely do something about it. The people in power who were saying this, and then we're doing nothing. Because there's something about it diffuses your momentum to push as an activist, and then nothing happens. Because if someone's coming at you going, no, I hate feminists, there's something you can push back against. But when people are sort of saying, yeah, you're right, and then still doing nothing, that's the really hard thing. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's that sort of, I'm a feminist, but like my work shouldn't really be under scrutiny here. We've really great figures. We've all that, like the resistance to participating in the research from people who really should have known better was pretty hard. And that sense again of like, oh God, we're all under scrutiny. It's like, well, some of these weren't even your programs. There were the previous artistic directors. So but like when you know a bit more about feminism, there's always a backlash, and sometimes it can be quite subtle. And in more recent years, oh, it's gone too far, or the pendulum has swung too far. It's like, it's still not even 50-50. So, Lian, you talk about this, people about, oppression, as I can't remember the exact quote. But it's, that thing of like, it doesn't feel the same if you're now disadvantaged, whereas once you were really, really privileged. So this
I think I know
like,
what you mean. I've forgotten this completely.
yeah,
Sorry.
we kind of slide back, and I think that's a real danger now with everything that we're seeing in wider society. And I don't think this movement could have happened in the way that it happened then, because it was right after marriage equality. There was a sense of equality was in the air in any case. So we were pushing, not that we knew it at the time, it didn't feel easy, but we were pushing on an open door between marriage equality and repeal the eighth, those referenda. And it had a momentum from other movements as well. We were able to have conversations, people were being listened to, and then we could just get policy changed, which seems, looking at it in retrospect, incredible that we were able to get that amount done in that space of time.
Thank you. I have a few more questions on my list, as you know, but I'm going to put those in my back pocket for now and turn to Andrea, if I may. And Andrea, what are you thinking as you hear this, and what kind of questions do you want to put to Sarah and Lian?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm hearing this, I've just been taking some notes. I think, this sense of, I think certainly in Toronto, as soon as the seasons are launched by small, medium, and large companies, I know that I'm not alone when the announcements happen. We immediately start counting, and that's not just me as an artistic director of a feminist theater company. I think that's most certainly artists, theater artists. I would imagine that some patrons also do that too, whether we're looking at parity, gender parity, or other indicators of equity-based programming. So that's I think that's something that interesting that that you touched on. I like that you put forward, I think it was you, Sarah, saying that you focused on governance and organization setting long-term strategy. And I think that's so clever. And I think what I've observed in my time in leadership and as a community member is that it's got the least pizzazz of an answer of how do you actually make change to think about policy and governance. But I think that the truth around top-down decision making as well, and in the sense of, it's one thing to say change what's on your stage, but you really have to go backwards all of the steps to say actually who is on your board and who is the artistic director and who is the artistic director programming and who is in their circle and what directors are being brought to that project, because that will directly reflect who's on stage and who's behind stage and the how of everything, of how things are being made. So I applaud you, and I think that speaks to the success of and the amazing thrust of the needle to go from 20% to 50% works on stage by women. Some of the other things that stood out to me, I really love this idea of that Lian, that you said we used peer pressure. It wasn't just the Abbey, and I think that we've seen that as something that's important that we really began to talk about during Me Too, when we said, yeah, we need to point out these particularly pernicious actors, but also we need to recognize that this is everywhere, and that it's not just the a celebrity to put on display, but actually how do we how do we look at that in our smaller spheres, and how do we in addition to that look at the bystanderism that happens, which I think, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but in Toronto, when we had kind of a cataclysmic moment back in 2018 around a leader and kind of a gross abuse of power that was happening, that was something that I found extremely eye-opening, was the shame and discomfort around the bystanders who had allowed certain behaviors to happen, and also the peer pressure of once we're part of a group saying something, we can be a lot stronger than being one voice that's speaking truth to power. Another thing that I thought was really beautifully articulated was this sense of timeline, that both of you acknowledged would be a vital ingredient to creating powerful change, and it's so obvious that was a key component in hearing about it. There's an organization that came out of kind of a movement a couple of years ago here in Toronto that became quickly nationwide in Canada, called Balancing Act. Karen, you probably know about Balancing Act in a big way, but it was inspired by other orgs actually in the UK and in the States, that began to really acknowledge the importance of artist caregivers in whatever those caregiving capacities might mean, and the impact of keeping particularly gendered folks who traditionally are caretakers, to keep us back in a position to be able to continue to make artistic work, particularly during the kind of sandwich generation, where a lot of people feel they need to exit the industry in order to take care of children or partners or elder people or spheres, other people in their lives. But there was this notion, I'm bringing that up because it was this very concerted effort to kind of go small and spread. It almost felt like a Tupperware party of I'll bring you and you'll bring 7 people, and one of each of those people will bring 7 more people, that kind of thing. But the thing that was constantly underlined, which made it so successful, was this notion of don't allow it to be a Pandora's box, thinking of small achievable goals, in the sense of what is one uniquely powerful thing that you can do, that your company can pilot and study it, report on it, determine how to not make it seem like an impossible thing. For example, the idea of bringing childcare to an artistic process. Well, that sounds pretty impossible for an art form that's already struggling to pay people well, or have beautiful sets, or get the marketing power that we need to get people to be in audiences. But to do small pilot projects, to think of them as pilots, to say, okay, we have 1 year to test out this experiment and see whether it works, and see if there's something that could be sustainable. So I don't know that those are questions so much as reflections back of, even though the change that you've created is unique to Ireland. I love that you said it wasn't just the Abbey, and that actually became this larger piece of policy, and that the Abbey became the lightning rod, but also, as you say, quickly apologized. Sarah joined the board, and it became a conversation piece with other organizations to say, how do we create policy that actually creates change in small, medium, and large organizations? Because it's easy for smaller organizations to say, oh, well, a larger organization, it's easier for them to make change actually because they have the money to do so, when larger organizations can be like large boats where it takes a much longer time for them to turn around. So I guess mostly it's kudos that I'm offering, but it feels like what you've offered is really tangible steps, not just in Ireland, but for any community to be listening to.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think I can take your reflections to prompt a question that I was thinking as well, which is, it would seem to me that there had to be someone amongst you who had had community organizing experience. Like, how did you know how to do that? To
Um,
put the year, how often you met, how you met, how you
there
articulated the
there
welfare,
were
all of that.
Yeah.
there were a couple of people who do have that kind of experience. Like I'm thinking of Maria Fleming, who had a sort of an activist background, who's been a producer for theatre for a long time, who's now currently the volunteer chair of the National Campaign for the Arts,
Mm.
as well as being the director of a mental health arts festival. So she, you know, for example, she was somebody who had some knowledge, but we just kind of pitched in. We asked as much as we could of people around us, like very, very quickly. Because like I was saying, that first flash happened in 2 weeks, which is insane. Like that event, which was 30 people on the stage of the National Theatre, completely sold out, child friendly, live streamed internationally to like thousands of other places, um, media organization, all of that happened in a week. And it was just, we are the best people in the world to be placed to do this. Like we literally know how to put on a show that well, that quickly. And we all knew that. I think one of the things that was amazing in that first week, and like Sarah and I've talked about it a lot, there was just this incredible feeling, which I don't know if I'll ever experience it again, which was a group of people getting into a room together who were, some of the people that I'd looked up to as leaders, very much in theatre in Ireland. And everybody just put their ego away and went, right, what do we need to do? This is really important. What are we going to do? You had people who I, would be sort of in awe of, who were, doing the grunt work with the rest of us. And things like we had 15 minutes to get into the theatre. I still actually don't know how there was a production team who were all, volunteered themselves, and I don't know how they did it, but we were all working at the top of our game because it was like we had all trained for this for our whole professional lives. And it was like, right, we have to do this perfectly. And we did.
And the whole thing was organized in 2 meetings, in about 2 hours each, with various groups meeting and different things. It was more our theatre skills and our producing skills. And I mean, all of the aspects of producing, the technical aspects, the design aspects. We had merch, we had signs, we had a website all up and running within a week. And it was just all of our theatre skills. It wasn't that we were planning a campaign, and we had one meeting, a kind of debrief meeting after, where we really put together, well, what do we want? And it was very much crowdsourced, from everyone throwing in their ideas and that just filtering through. And there wasn't, it did come to kind of a consensus, but there was still a lot of, disagreement as well, not a lot, but there was some as the year went on and what we would focus on. But by and large, anyone could do what they wanted, and some things stuck and some things didn't. So having that freedom between the grassroots, but then kind of wasn't that we were a rigid core campaign, but we were just got laser focused.
Thank you. So, Andrea, just to open up the conversation to inform Sarah and Lian and our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about Nightwood Theatre and about its particular history and mission as a feminist theater?
Yeah,
What
sure.
what does that look like?
Sure. And well, just as we're talking, I'm thinking about how WTF was kind of like the sprint, whereas Nightwood Theatre is like the endurance race. But Nightwood was founded 46 years ago in 1979 by 4 women in Toronto. We're based in Toronto, which is one of, or the most multicultural city in the world. Half of our residents are born outside of Canada, so Toronto is a really distinctive place in the world map, I think. Our what we boast is that we're Canada's preeminent feminist theater. We cultivate, create, and produce extraordinary theater by women and gender expansive artists, liberating futures one room at a time. We have created, produced, and toured award-winning plays that have garnered numerous awards, and is helmed by myself and managing director Naz Afsahi LeBlanc. We're a small but mighty company. We're considered a mid-sized company in Toronto. And in our 46 years, I think, interestingly, have kind of embraced and de-embraced and embraced and de-embraced and embraced the claim to the word feminist over time, which is interesting. And I imagine that will be something that probably happens as the company continues to evolve and grow over time in the next 46 years and beyond. When we talk about feminism, we talk about feminism as a series of frameworks, ideologies, and movements specific to each era, region, and culture. We recognize that feminism is ever-changing and evolving with the ultimate goal of a world where women and gender-expansive people have complete autonomy over their own lives. So I think something that has always been key for Nightwood is a sense of propelling people forward, and creating a supportive space to thrive within. In the beginning, especially, I think, because the Toronto theater scene was completely hostile to women. I'm 48, so I was just a wee babe when Nightwood was being founded. But I can say for myself, as someone who, has been working for 25 years or so, the ecology has significantly shifted even within those 2 decades, for myself. When I came up, it was very normal to me that the only female artistic directors would either be maybe running a theater for young audiences organization, maybe. There would be a woman running Nightwood Theater, and perhaps some mavericks who had started their own companies but didn't necessarily have a ton of funding. That was the landscape that I came into. Certainly, all of my mentors initially were male artistic directors, most of whom were absolutely wonderful to me, but it was a very different time. And I know for myself, I think it probably took me at least into a full decade of working to, and probably therefore into my 30s, to be able to assert that I was, smart enough to handle a budget, and, grown up enough and tough enough to handle sticky situations. But there was definitely a real lack of feeling of trust in being a woman at the helm, for sure. I think in terms of Nightwood's mission, we talk about, in terms of feminism, in terms of how do we bake that into our work. We think about representation, for sure. We think about process, for sure, and content. So I think representation is pretty clear, but to say it outright, at Nightwood, one of the distinctive aspects of our company is that everyone who works at Nightwood, in the office, in production, primarily on our as creators or playwrights, as directors, the majority of our board are women or gender expansive folks, and that's been key to us continuing to populate a sector with people who can work at the top of their craft, and to have that mentorship baked into the work that we do. And a lot of what we have found, one of the most powerful ways that we have found to to empower the next generation is to focus actually a lot of our resources on either championing emerging folks who are coming up to be able to take on larger future leadership roles, for example, like myself, like Naz, my managing director partner, who started at Nightwood as an intern and has moved through that process for, I think, 12 years. It's a big piece of what we do. And we also, take chances on often earlier writers, earlier directors to be able to give the opportunities to make that big leap from being an emerging director or writer to someone who's gaining the experience of having their works on medium and larger stages. Something that we've invested in a lot in the last couple of years is thinking about process. So thinking about the how we do what we do as a key, as kind of the what next of how do we keep evolving. And so that for us looks like models of care. It looks like Nightwood, for example, was a very early advocate of a 5-day rehearsal week versus in Canada, I'm assuming in Ireland as well, the standard 6-day week. And it was every time it was time to set up a rehearsal process, had to fight with our representatives at Canadian Actors Equity Association to explain why it was key for our artists that instead of working for 4 weeks, 8-hour days, 6 days a week, that we could prorate a process and work 5 days a week for 6-hour days in order to be able to pick up a kid at daycare, to be able to take care of their own wellness needs, to be able to manage energy, and acknowledge all of the multiplicity of unspoken and often unpaid labor that our artists were invested in. So that's one example. Another example, which came actually through as being a partner of Balancing Act in the first year, was developing what we call a compassion fund, in which 0.5 of our operating annual revenue is always put towards a compassion fund that can go towards childcare, that could go towards transportation, that could go towards therapy, for example, beyond the benefits that our actors get, for work that might be requiring extra levels of support. And that it's I think it's that idea of this not being this Pandora's box, but these small expressions of care and acknowledgement that make going to work that much easier for the people that we serve. I think the really what I also want to say in terms of how Nightwood has evolved. When I came in 2019, it became, as I was interviewing as artistic director, there were two things that I found very daunting, aside from just the work of applying. But the first one was, why does Nightwood Theatre need another white leader in a legacy of 45 years of basically white leadership in Toronto, the most multicultural city in the world? And the second thing that was daunting to me was, at the time, Nightwood was considered the company that was theater by women for everyone. And at the time, I think certainly myself, and I felt like the environment around me was really starting to wonder, well, what about all of the expansiveness of gender that we're looking at? And at a certain point, I kind of went, well, okay, so if we expand to people who have faced gender oppression, are we looking at saying that we're expressly anti-TERF, so we already are acknowledging that cis and trans women are part of that umbrella of women, but what do we do about all of our non-binary folks, our two-spirit folks? What about trans men who have also had an experience with gender oppression? And so ultimately, I kind of went, if I come in as a leader, am I just going to say that we're supporting basically everyone but cis men? And then I kind of went, well, yeah, actually, that's what we're going to do. So that's been a big shift for Nightwood, and bringing all of the folks along with us over that time. Some people who really needed a lot of education to embrace that. Some people who deeply resisted that. Some people who said, finally, it's about time. I've never felt welcome at Nightwood because of that. So that was a piece. And then I think in terms of the other multiple intersections of identity, recognizing that though I still elected to apply for the position, that I really feel like it would be, to my shock and dismay, if when I leave Nightwood, there will be another white woman in this role. And I don't think that would be possible. And I think in the 7 years that I've been at Nightwood, we've done a lot of, as you know, as Sarah had said earlier, that governance piece and policy piece around how do we ensure that IBPOC folks are really set up to thrive within our organization, which again comes down to so much policy, so much anti-oppression, anti-racism work that we've done, and looking at our board to really understand why I got this job, why there are certain biases that made me a really great candidate, and I am for all sorts of really, really legitimate reasons. But also, how do we make sure that Nightwood is the feminist theater of Canada for the future? And I think that's really key to who we are and the work that we do. And I will say has come from a long legacy of that, but is very articulated at this point in time. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Andrea. And you've brought us beautifully into where the conversation is gonna go, which is now. So Lian and Sarah, could I ask you how are we doing now in Ireland around Irish theatre and gender and questions of equality more broadly? We are aware of a swing to the right in global politics. We're aware of a backlash against EDIA policies and realities. Is that hitting you? And how?
I think it's safe to say a huge amount has changed since the just over 10 years since Waking the Feminist kicked off. Really, a huge amount has changed. And I think we are all the more aware of the things that haven't changed or that still need to be addressed. I at the so the book came out a few months ago, and the first sort of public event of it was in the Abbey Theatre, and it was an onstage conversation between Sarah Durcan, and Sarah Ahmed, who's a feminist. I was about to say academic, but I don't think she calls herself an academic anymore, but a feminist writer. Who was also publishing a book around the same time. And to introduce that event, at the start, I was sitting in the audience, and I just had this moment of going, oh, 3 of my friends have just walked on stage, and they were 3 women I know from a long time ago in different ways. And then I went, oh no, hang on. That's the head of the Gate Theatre, which is the second highest funded theatre in Ireland, which was also kind of at the epicenter of Me Too because of a previous director who'd worked there for a long time in Ireland. That sort of Me Too coalesced around him. So a female director of the Gate, a female director of the National Theatre, and the first ever female director of the Dublin Theatre Festival since it was founded in 1957. So all of a sudden, just the symbolism or the imagery of 3 women walking on stage who were all in those positions was extraordinary. And, you know, they just had to walk on stage and smile, and everybody gave them a rousing round of applause. So that kind of thing has really had a big impact. We're seeing a lot more work on stages by women. It did open, I think, a sense of possibility and openness to change. So when something like the Black Lives Matter sort of re-emerged as a conversation during lockdown, it meant, I think, that people were a lot of women who were already thinking about change, and men as well, to be fair, were able to kind of for a start, some of those policies were already starting to be in place in terms of diversity and equality, but then they were able to put programs in place and sort of make sure that now there is a lot more diversity being seen on stage than there was 10 years ago, which is great. It's definitely not finished. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to add? There's more things.
Yeah, I suppose we can complicate that in, we've seen theatre funding proportionately go down, where, there's a little spidey sense in me that's going, is that really, are we being punished for being, so truculent around this? There's no evidence, strong evidence for it, but there's always that little, is this part of the backlash? Whereas funding for the arts has grown exponentially over the last few years, and there's now a basic income that has been extended for artists as well, which I think is fairly groundbreaking. At the same time, and Andrea, for the things that you're talking about, there's a sense of the sector still been, to the pin of its collar, really overstretched, burnt out, overworked. Everyone's trying to do more and more. And that sense of austerity, I think, to talk about the economics of it, has never left the theatre, whereas other sectors have recovered. So there's still this sort of, oh my God, we have to do more for less all of the time. And that is exhausting. And there's still, so many people have left the sector, and then you still have the new, and the cycle is going over and over again. So I think these are more structural things to do, not just with gender or diversity in general, but the general state of the arts and its ability to respond to what's going on. There's lots of campaigns at the moment to hold on to any kind of art spaces in Dublin. They have just disappeared as property prices have gone up and up. And I suppose the other link, to what Lian was talking about, the 3 artistic directors walking out on stage, the research for Waking the Feminists found that, 10 years ago, and it looked back over the previous 10 years for the 10 of the highest funded theatre organisations, was the more money an organisation had, the less likely it was to programme women. It wasn't that we had a pipeline issue. We had there was bookloads of women around the place who were having successful careers on the fringe, or Andrea, as you said, had set up their independent companies or were working internationally, but just weren't getting the breaks where the bigger houses were and the bigger money. And I always think that's really interesting to continue to follow the money with all of these things. Are women still getting the opportunities, but on smaller stages or in fringe programs or in training programs, but not necessarily getting the big shows? Now, we are seeing some of that, but there's still like, oh, are they selling the tickets still? So I still think there's deeper work to be done there with audience response and involving the audience in those conversations as well. Because I think as people who work in the theatre, we assume an awful lot of what the audience without actually asking them. So I think there's more research to be done around that area as well. So it's better in a lot of ways. There's an awful lot more openness in talking about. There's a whole program, as I was saying, about Safe to Create. There's training for boards. There's bystander training. There's more awareness of childcare and other issues. That is not to say that bullying has disappeared in the arts. It's not to say that people aren't still being disadvantaged, and that people also feel is very unfair that women are getting a slight bit more of the pie as well. And I think that general sense of austerity has been very, very difficult.
Thank you. You've hinted at this, Lian and Sarah, and I know this is a complicated question to broach, but the colonial histories of our countries are very different. And Andrea, started by talking about the extraordinary diversity of Toronto, which is just a given, right? And that has meant that what equality, diversity, and inclusion means in Canada and in Toronto, and then you add in the questions of Indigenous histories and the particular legacies of colonialism. That's a particular bunch of stuff that we're very familiar with here, which raises questions about representation, certainly in terms of leadership, as Andrea has very candidly talked about being a white woman who got her job. Can you just give us a little bit of a snapshot about how questions of diversities beyond gender are playing out in Ireland at the moment in your worlds?
Mm. Yeah, it's for anyone who doesn't know, like until very recently, Ireland was very, very white monocultural place. Um, Really in my lifetime, like as a child, it would be rare to see Black people in the street. And in the last, well, since the economic boom, we've had a lot more immigrants coming to the country. So we're at a point of sort of seeing um, first and second generation immigrants in Ireland. And I am now doing a lot of work with younger artists through organizations like Irish Theatre Institute, who are actively trying to support and promote Black and brown people into positions as artists and as lead artists. Um, that can be really difficult because some people um, are working full-time jobs because they've come to the country and need to be able to support themselves. Um, yeah, it's a really tricky place that we're in because it's so new to us. I mean, even as I'm talking about it, I'm going, yeah, it's hard to articulate always. Um, but I do think we have a kind of an interesting opportunity because this has been a conversation from so early on in a time of us being a multicultural society. Um, that we have an opportunity to build on that. And also we're able to sort of, I hope, look around us and see how other people have, or other countries have maybe tried other things that didn't work, and we get to try things that maybe did work. Um, the other thing is that what's great is like we're seeing a lot of work also by queer people, by trans people. We are starting to see that sort of representation on stage. But yeah, underlying a lot of the conversations that I'm having with younger artists now is it's a real struggle, no matter who you are, but all of those things compound, obviously, but it's just a really difficult time to be an artist in Ireland. Um, the money is very scarce, but it's also extremely expensive to live here, particularly in Dublin. It's extremely expensive to live in Dublin. So people are um, trying to subsidize their artist work with other jobs, um, or are living at home, or have to leave the city, or have to sometimes leave the country. So there's at the moment, for particularly young artists, I don't think it's really easy for anybody, but it's even less easy for people who are immigrants or who are having to deal with other kinds of discrimination.
And I'd
Thank
add
you.
to that class as well. And I think this
Yeah.
is happening right across the theatre world. You know, it was always there, but it's become more and more pronounced, because of that affordability issue and pathways in through whether it's youth theatre or community theatre groups as well. And that general education in arts is diminishing somewhat as well. And of course, we've the other complication of, of Northern Ireland as well, where the arts funding, whatever it is in ours, they look at ours and go, oh my God, we're rolling in it. And it's particularly because Waking the Feminists also happened in the north of Ireland, and was much more successful, say, in the Me Too route, but hasn't had when we can compare the numbers, and similar research was done throughout the north as well, and it didn't take off because an awful lot more complications with colonial and post trouble conversations that are still much high. So like the woman question as such is still much further down, but there's this last year there was a front and center conference which is foregrounding women and gender diverse people as well, and that's happening again in Derry this year. But the funding there, and I suppose the crisis of Brexit as well, and what's happening in the UK, and then the absolute chilling effect of the rise of the right wing, or even the ability to have the conversations that we were able to have online. It wasn't pretty, but it wasn't orchestrated misogyny and hatred and fascism that we're seeing now in the world. I don't know if I would feel in the same way about going on Twitter. Well, I wouldn't be on Twitter now. That conversation, and Lian and we've spoken about the spaces available to have these conversations and have community and just be able to hang out, because the money is so tight, and yet we're rolling in money, officially from a GDP point of view.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And sorry, go on, Karen.
No, so I'm just going to encourage our listeners. We're getting close to the time where we might be able to take some questions from the audience. So please do put questions in the Q&A if you have questions for any of our speakers. Sorry, Lian, back to you.
No, I was just thinking the other thing it's maybe because I am often at the moment I do a lot of work running and facilitating support programs for other artists. And so I am working a lot with often younger artists, people in their 20s and 30s. And then when, the 10-year anniversary of Waking the Feminist rolled around, and I was like, oh, that was 10 years ago. Some of these people were like in school and don't have a kind of and then of course there was the big blank space that was COVID, where we all had to stop working, and there wasn't that kind of the places that we hang out in where we get to pass knowledge on. So we've been really aware that, to do something like this took us, what did we think in the end? It was like nearly 4 years, 4.5 years. Myself and Sarah ended up working on this. And after about 3 years working on it, I remember Sarah turning to me and saying, I'm really glad we started working on this when we did, because I've already started to forget. Like when I go back and read some of the stuff we originally wrote, I've already started to forget some of that. Like the memory is very short. And it's really, really important to pass on what has happened and what has changed, but also to pass on what hasn't changed or what has changed for the worse, so that younger people and people who are coming after us know what they still, what maybe has been lost, but also what they can still fight for. So that's been a really big part of what we wanted to, we wanted to sort of put this down on paper and have it in libraries and so on, so people can access that kind of knowledge.
And you can see it in the speeches of what has changed and what hasn't, because there's 3 sections of speeches from the public meetings. And I'm thinking of Rosaleen McDonough's talking about her experience as a traveller and a queer woman, and some of that hasn't changed enough in Ireland at the moment either.
Thank you. Andrea, can I bring it back to you and ask you, you've already brought us up to the present in terms of thinking about Nightwood and what your hopes are for the company going forward. Can you address the scene more broadly for Toronto and Canadian theater? I mean, I think that there are a lot of resonances. Like, we cannot emphasize enough how expensive it is to live in Ireland right now. It is incredible how expensive Dublin is, and that has an effect on everyone, including young people, including artists. I first moved to Ireland in 1997, which is when everything was starting to change. And I remember, the memories of FOSS schemes. Remember FOSS schemes? And how there were all of these boondoggles where arts organizations could hire students and unemployed people, and through kind of a social welfare program that enabled arts to happen. but part of that was the fact that you could still afford to live in Dublin on not a huge amount of money. And that has really, the society has turned over a number of times in my living history of Ireland, but the cost of living thing is like so real. So Andrea, what's your perception in terms of younger artists that you might be working with or colleagues in the field about how much we've been able to come back from COVID and how are we doing overall?
Yeah.
Big question, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I was just reading about the universal basic income for artists, and thinking what a triumph. But I'm sure those amounts don't necessarily even make it necessarily livable in Dublin. But yeah, I mean, I would say that it's all relative, and I would say that the artists of Toronto are feeling very much that way, especially younger people who have no hope in home ownership at any point in their lives at this point. It feels like we're both kind of hearing from younger generations that they have a strong ethic around care and around moving against kind of in extreme hustle culture that certainly I came up through and have always worked two jobs basically, at least to make everything work. For once in my life, I don't have to, but now I sometimes elect to because I want to do other projects. But there is this sense of I don't want to hustle, but also the work is so scarce and yeah, it's really challenging. And I think also, for myself coming up, I came up in a time where part of several of the experiences that got me confident to be a director, for example, were around volunteerism. So I would work all sorts of other weird hours, doing all sorts of other things to make money, and then be able to work for free and be in rehearsal and observe and learn from people who had more experience than me. And I mean, now that's just simply we don't do that anymore because of the kind of equity framework around that of those who are able to energetically or financially not work full time to learn how to do, like, it just gives such a disproportionate advantage to certain people. So it's a really, yeah, when I talk with up and coming artists to say, what is the pathway to get there? It's a tough answer because a lot of my answer involved working nonstop or working for free and waiting till something stuck. So that's really hard in this economy. To zoom wider around, I was poking around for some statistics around to see if things have improved in Canada. And in fact, we're meeting soon, I think next week, with the Playwrights Guild of Canada and the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres to see if we can start a new study to get some updated statistics, because things go extinct pretty fast, information. But in 1981, 10% of playwrights were women. When I came in at Nightwood in 2019, in national theaters, 31% of plays produced were by women. It became higher when it was Canadian work, so I think that's really interesting. In 2019, 38% of shows were Canadian produced shows were by women. And more recently in the 22-23 season, 40% of plays were women and 39% were men. So that's interesting. And 3% were non-binary playwrights and 18% were mixed gendered projects. So that's actually pretty uplifting. I think what I would say is that, like with, when the companies announce our seasons and we do the kind of finger count of how many this is and how many that's, I think it's kind of about being alert to that. And representation is not the only solve in all of this, but I think it's actually it's pretty important to know that there are eyes out there watching watching what's happening. And I think and hope that the more we create works that enrich the lives of all of the people who come to see theater, that will be what not only artists demand, but also what patrons demand as well.
Thanks, Andrea. So when you say that you're going to be talking to PGC Impact, is that about the equity in theater, the tradition of the equity in theater studies, and see
Yeah,
if we can get
exactly.
another one?
Yeah. So it would basically be us writing a grant to the Canada Council for the Arts to do a sector innovation grant, to spend a whole lot of time researching and hiring a researcher to do that work. Because we need those numbers to make sure that we're moving in a direction.
Yeah, it occurs to me to mention an interesting project that you probably know about, Andrea, called Pledge, which is a academic and professional kind of collaboration to gather in Canada plays by women, and gender nonconforming folks, and just putting a list on the internet of what those are, so that you can't get the answer of like, oh, I don't know what's out there. It's like, here, look, a website. And thinking in particular, because I cross over between academia and the profession, that academic, like drama departments putting on plays, there's such an opportunity there for those plays to be representative, because often drama departments have more female identifying students than men, or, and also you can mess around in that setting in terms of why does the gender assigned at birth of the actor have to assign to the character. And so I know that part of the impetus behind Pledge was to make sure that at the educational level as well, that educators can look and see that there's, wealths of plays by playwrights like Erin Shields, whose work you're directing right now, Andrea, have written large cast female-led plays that are about history. And, and so I'm excited by that work that can be moving alongside the profession to make sure that information is being shared about the work that's out there. I am going to put a question to Lian and Sarah that's come to us from Aideen in the chat, who asks, I'm curious to know if Minister Patrick O'Donovan has any concrete plans or commitment to include theatre as part of his mandate, or does it get overshadowed by sport and other cultures, in inverted commas, in Ireland? Would I be right in understanding from this question that Minister Patrick O'Donovan is the Minister of Culture, et cetera, at the moment?
Yeah, that's the best way of putting it, culture, etc. Because the department changes so frequently, and has done. Michael D. Higgins was our first minister for the arts back in the 90s, and has gone through, and at the cabinet table, it's certainly not the plum job. It's sort of like, who do we give this to? So the theatre is part of the mandate, as are the broader arts, but actually it is an arm's length organisation. The Arts Council, who funds it, apart from the national cultural institutions, except the Abbey. So it's quite complicated. So the Abbey's money comes through the Arts Council, but all of the other national cultural institutions are funded directly from the department. So that's why the theatre budget looks disproportionately large within it. But if you look at everything else, it's not. So yeah, it's interesting to see that it always is that thing between sports and then everything else. But no, culture, certainly since the last minister came in, has it certainly increased an awful lot in funding, but then as we've seen, the costs have gone, but theatre specifically has not benefited, whereas the costs have gone, through the roof, but no one's earning more money than they did even 10 years ago, whether it's playwrights or actors or whatever. It's bizarre how inflation hasn't kept up with how people are actually being paid. So I hope that answers the question about, yes, it is in his remit, but at a step remove. And the Arts Council itself has gone through its own crises recently and lost a brilliant director in Maureen Kennelly, who was kind of thrown under the bus by the politicians. And unfortunately, it was just to do with procurement around a computing project, so structure and governance still matters.
It is such great news to know that Maureen is back working in the sector as the, I think CEO is the title now of Druid Theatre Company. So a great colleague is back in leadership where she belongs. There is a gorgeous question here in the chat from Lindy asking, what is the best way for the average theatre patron in Ireland and Canada to advocate for equality and equal representation in the arts?
Go and see the work. Go to shows by women, go to shows by underrepresented people, and also feel entitled to ask your theaters if they're not being shown there, why aren't they being shown there? Like, feel entitled to say, I'd really like to see some more work by women, or, whatever sort of priority you'd like to put on that. But you have that power.
And then respond to the shows, tell them what you think, how it was, because I think there is this kind of dark, the show goes out there and then it's like, what, that feedback, and like the criticism is such a huge part of that. And Karen, as you know, and Lian, we've discussed this as well. One of the other things that's happened, which is a real shame, is the diminution of criticism and the space to talk about theatre in our national papers. The Irish Theatre Magazine, the Theatre Awards are gone now as well. So there is a worry, having had theatre as such the heart of the cultural conversation in Ireland for so long and one of our biggest cultural exports. The worry, if that continues over time, how can it be part of the wider cultural and political and socioeconomic conversation if it can't cut through? The work is fine, the audience are having, but like the bigger conversation beyond just what's on stage.
Thank you. Andrea, do you have any thoughts about how folks can advocate for equality and equal representation in the arts?
Yeah, I think you two have covered it. I think, attend, participate, and make and be vocal to artistic directors. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think, speaking from the reception, the criticism side, there is so much less space now for response. But I do think that I can certainly say, knowing the mainstream media, like, write in the comment sections of reviews, respond, write to the arts editor, and write to artistic directors. The voice of the public is when the public speaks in a reasonable and thoughtful way, as opposed to shouting on X. I think that those voices are more powerful than I think folks would think. That's what everybody wants to know, is how folks are responding. I think go see the work, because this has been a conversation so much tonight about structures, about leadership, about governance, about change. We haven't been talking much about what's on the stages. So I think, like, to think about, like, the whole reason why we're talking about this is putting beautiful, important work on stages, artists working, and people going to see it. And so I think finishing with the idea of go, I think, is really important. Before I close us off, Lian and Sarah, I think you were going to leave us with a rousing quote by a great Irish female writer.
Yeah. Do you want to read it, or will I?
Will we read the short version or the long one?
Well, I've just got this bit.
Oh yeah.
Will I go through it?
Sure.
So this is by Anne Enright, who's an incredible writer, Irish writer. If you don't know her, get her books. She's great. Waking the Feminists made me realize that there was no point asking anymore, because the people who thought they were listening really were not listening. And besides, what is that posture? The one where you ask and are accepted or turned down? I realized we had to come at it from outside the system, because the system was incapable of regulating or fixing itself. In 2016, I learned the power of counting, because numbers are factual, and the facts don't lie or feel sorry for themselves or quote Yeats back at you or wish you were more like their mother or less like their mother. In 2016, I realized that men find it hard to change when it is not in their interests to change. So sadly, sometimes you have to run them over with a truck or with a crowd. In 2016, I did something I find difficult as an individual artist to do. I joined a benevolent and righteous crowd. I have not looked back.
Thank you so much, Lian, Sarah, and Andrea, for this great conversation. And I'll hand it back to you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Lian, Sarah, and Andrea. On behalf of the foundation and our audience, I want to give you a large thank you for sharing with us your experiences and the work you are doing to advance feminism in the theater and in our lives more broadly. You have given us the most interesting and thoughtful exchange of ideas. And Karen, thank you for facilitating that. You've left us all challenged and inspired, more aware of the possibility for change, and certainly the successes you've enjoyed and the challenges that are still with all of us. And I want to thank you for that. And so before we bring our evening to a close, I'd like to invite you all, our audience and all of you, to join us as we launch our theater festival, Bealtaine, in May. And we are very excited about this because we are going to, for the first time ever, bring our theater festival to the Corlec, which is soon to be opened on the Toronto waterfront on Erin Quay. It will be our new home, and we are very excited to welcome our first guests and attendees there. Our festival kicks off on about May 21st and will run into the first part of June. And we will be presenting three smaller presentations: Chicken by Sunday's Child, Bellow by Broken Talkers, and You'll See by Branagh. And we are going to, that'll take us into Luminato, which we're very happy to be hosting at the Corlec this year, or an event there. And then into September, we'll be presenting Lunasa, our Irish music festival, on the 11th, 12th, and 13th over the weekend. Some folk and some rock and some R&B from the island of Ireland. And we are really excited to close out our year at the Corlec with Endgame by Samuel Beckett. And speaking of Druid Theatre, it will be presented by Druid, internationally acclaimed for their innovative and rigorous Irish theatre. Additional details and tickets for all of these can be found on the foundation website, CanadaIrelandFoundation.com. And you can also follow our progress and stay connected with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and a very good evening to all.